It probably won't surprise you to hear that I like games. I spend a lot of time playing them, and just as much time watching other people play them, or review them, or cover news about the people making them. In that time, I've sampled a variety of different genres. I think it's fair to say that out of all of them, RPGs, or role-playing games, are some of my favourite. I even have a particular fondness for traditional turn-based JRPGs. Call it the Pokemon effect or whatever. But I've always had fun just hitting buttons, building XP, and improving skills. With that being said, however, I have had enough of RPG mechanics in fantasy fiction. From what I can tell, this is a relatively recent phenomenon, building up over the last decade or so, and for all I know, it's just a fad with a few big cash cows the publishers have been chasing that will simmer back down into a respectable niche once the fever passes, and if so, then boy, will I look like a fool when it's all over. But until such a day arrives, I reserve the right to complain about it because... To be clear, I'm not going to go after any stories with video game settings today. That's outside the scope of this video, and I think that there's much less of a fundamental, conceptual problem when a game mechanic magic system stems diegetically from the setting of the story. It makes sense for things to look like a video game if they happen in a video game. I've even watched several stories based both in and around video games that I had a really good time with. Video games are not the problem. Games have a lot of functions, both in real life and in stories. They can be competitions, personal challenges, and social environments. In that sense, they are indistinguishable from any sport, endeavour, or location that a story might feature or be based around. I'm sure you can come up with an example of a story that you love based around each of those three subjects. Video games are not a genre, they're a medium, and as such, they cannot be held accountable for the trends that I am seeing. As much as I would like them to be. But the point! A member of the crowd shouts at the screen helplessly, as this is a pre-recorded video made from a script. What's your point, Mr. Disembodied Voice Man? Well, luckily for you, unknown impotent viewer, I'll tell you. While video games and video game-based media as a whole can largely be described as, well, not inoffensive, and not necessarily conceptually sound either. Ignorable? Yeah, let's go with ignorable. While video games and video game-based media as a whole can largely be described as not on my immediate shit list, there is a sub-category that has quickly climbed up the ranks, settling in just above high school, but for some specific activity that's made both wildly impractical and considerably more boring by teaching it in a school, but not quite beating out unironic grimdark. And that subcategory is RPG logic in non-game fantasy worlds. The exact flavour and extent of the game logic can vary from story to story, but generally they include, and are not limited to, adventurers guilds and their dumbass ranking systems, quest boards, explicit mentions of classes/jobs, fucking skills, experience points and levels, demon lords or big bads the protagonist fights out of obligation rather than personal motivation, chosen hero, bonus points if magically summoned, inexplicable or self-justifying dungeons, ecosystems built solely for violence, and, most tellingly, stat screens. Many of these features you might recognise as things that make sense to include in a video game for the sake of creating a more enjoyable gameplay experience, or are simply just holdovers from the earliest iterations of the RPG genre, back when processing power was more limited and games had to be linear by necessity. Over time, these things have become increasingly codified into the geek zeitgeist, and have the tendencies to be approached with a less critical eye as they become almost expected. The problem is that they kinda fucking suck in any medium other than an actual game. Some of them are strongly related. The idea of adventuring being a viable enough career for there to be an adventurers guild naturally requires the setting to have a near limitless supply of beasts and monsters for adventurers to fight, which you can get away with in a game because it means that players don't get bored, but would completely destroy any pretense of an ecosystem in an actual world. Some authors, who thought they were so very smart, believe they could ignore this fact if they confined all their monsters to magical infinite dungeons that churn them out ad nauseum for reasons so unscrupulous that even they don't know them. There's a precedent for this. There's the dungeon crawler style of RPG. They're quite popular. I myself am a fan. They just forgot one thing, however! The main appeal of dungeon crawlers is their gameplay! They are not well known for their storytelling, and only a fool or an absolute man would write the motivation for entering the dungeon in their dungeon crawler as because it was there. What do you have to offer me in a dungeon crawling story that's better than me playing an actual honest-to-God dungeon crawler? Do you really think that describing a dungeon crawl to me is somehow more fun for me than just playing it myself? Do you think explaining the mechanics of a fictional game is what I have come to you for? Do you think the Warcraft movie would have been saved if it had spent 40 minutes showing a steady stream of orcs coming out of a building, standing in a big clump together, and then charging all at once to hit the humans' walls with axes? Do you think Edgerunners should have been released halfway through production, put people into epileptic fits, and received a bunch of minor improvements over several years? Should the Mario movie have included a scene where Chris Pratt backwards long jumps up a set of stairs to save time? This is especially the case in worlds that are supposedly not video games, but generic fantasy worlds with magic systems that just so happen to operate awfully similar to an RPG. Making your not a video game world more like a video game whilst insisting on it not actually being a video game is trying to eat your cake and have it too. It's not particularly smart, it's certainly not new anymore, and it doesn't play to the strengths of whatever other medium you're using. We can all see what's going on. We're not going to pretend that Sword Art Online wasn't a landmark piece of fiction in the genre, for better or worse, and more importantly, made a whole blood-splattered truckload of money in the process. And as much as I'd like to rag on SAO at this point, I am forced, against my will, to turn around and say, no, it's not SAO's fault if a bunch of other authors flooded the market with a bunch of shoddy imitations that lifted aspects of its VR MMO sci-fi story and planted them directly into fantasy settings without any degree of critical thought. I could very easily go off on one about SAO's fucking skill system, and many people have already done that for me, because it's not particularly well thought out. But its existence at least makes some sense in the environment of a digital simulation designed for escapist gameplay. You can imagine my frustration, however, if a system that numerically measures, categorizes, and ranks individual physical attributes, ability, and training were to somehow find its way into a setting which is not based on a computer program or simulation. How nonsensical would it be for a person to be fundamentally unable even to make an attempt to swing a sword, or provide medical support, or cook without a prerequisite command learned or skill tree progressed through? At what points would the world decide to gate these specific tasks? Would I be unable to peel a potato without at least one stat point in sharp weapons? Is there a point of having schools and teachers if you can learn whatever you want by just killing enough of the local fauna? How much XP does my baby need before it unlocks the walk skill? And boy, do not get me started on unique skills, which usually seem to be the sole reason a lot of these skill-based magic systems are included in the first place. We already have ways to give your protagonist unique abilities that no one else can do. Superpowers have been popular for decades, and proper actual magic has been a part of fiction for centuries. You don't need to force a video game skill system into your fantasy world to justify your special little guy being the most uniquest and bestest person in the whole world. Oh boy, oh shucks. And don't get me started on stories that have a leveling system just so they can have their protagonist start at max fucking level. Adding an objective numerical value to how much stronger your character is than everyone else does not make them seem cooler. It just makes the author sound insecure. Do not start me on power level! The gamification of a fictional world carries with it very serious consequences for your setting and story that would take far more work to unravel than it would be worth. I've already mentioned the tendency to have a menagerie of species whose sole reason for existence is to fuck people up who somehow have not and cannot be hunted to extinction. It may be fun to throw a whole Pokédex's worth of monsters at a story's characters for the novelty of variety, but the general audience knows that there's a limit to how many aggressive animals any environment can sustain, and the more different recolors of Dragon Quest enemies you throw into your world, the less believable the world becomes. The easier it is for people to see the man behind the curtain, the hand of the author. It's not impossible to justify this in a setting, but that requires more time and attention, and with those the focus of the story shifts towards being about just that one choice. The existence of stats and skills in a serious fantasy setting is also something I usually find hard to swallow. Attaching number values to important aspects of human existence can seriously change the way we process information and make decisions. Not everyone is swayed by stats and values in the same way or to the same extent, but the consequences of these systems would be pervasive and long-lasting, especially if the people who engage with these systems with their more mathematical approach can game the system and gain power over the people around them in doing so. Over the course of a world's history, the very structure of the universe would encourage its citizens to prioritize whatever makes the numbers go up, and to form a rigid hierarchy based on a seemingly objective but equally arbitrary set of rules and measurements. It inherently generates a perception of people being seen as of different value to each other because they have been quantified and reduced to entries on a spreadsheet. And that's fucked up on its own, but it gets worse as the protagonist's value is also tied into climbing this hierarchy until they become the objective peak of human existence, which is usually judged by their ability to inflict harm on others. Does that sound like a fair assessment of a person's worth to you? That a person is only as good as the number of asses they can kick? It's an almost psychopathic metric of value, but it is one that resonates with some aspects of the video game subculture. There has been a growing philosophy in the general community that prioritizes being good at interacting with the art form of video games over all the other ways to enjoy and engage with them. It's not too surprising that games would foster a spirit of competitiveness, but attaching someone's worth to their aptitude with games, either individual or in general, is complete nonsense, by which of course I mean total bullshit. But that's what's happening in these fantasy stories. And while we're on the subject of the game of power fantasy, I want to swing back around to those stupid fucking stat screens protagonists keep using. Here is the clear evidence of how this subgenre leans towards having your cake and eating it too. It's obvious enough how both Portal and non-Portal fantasy can serve as a self-insert power fantasy for readers who want to imagine themselves as the hero of their favourite video game. They get the abilities, the companions, the prestige, all the things an RPG protagonist traditionally earns. But one thing an RPG protagonist does not traditionally get in their games is access to a command console. The character is not the one interacting with the game's UI, it's the player who does that. So when a fantasy protagonist has access to a game mechanic in their story, they are also playing the role of the player. The thing is that a player has a completely different role than a character in a game. We know this, for this is the gap that this type of fiction tries to bridge. While a character is in the midst of a world and its conflicts, a player is by their nature detached from them. There's a distance, both physical and emotional, between them. While a character acts, they do not make choices of their own. A player chooses, but cannot act. A player is a being that looks upon the world from above, acting as both strategist and storyteller, able to bend time itself to their whims, and protected from any greater loss than a wasted evening and perhaps some carpal tunnel. A player is, in a sense, a minor deity to the worlds they visit, their power only secondary to the gods that carved out the landscape and spun the tapestry of its fate. The designer, the writer, the coder, the artist, the musician. What you get when you merge a minor deity with a mortal is not the best of both worlds, but a being who belongs to neither. A character who can see the world before them reduced to mere equations on a spreadsheet no longer sees it without that filter. The stat screen is a barrier between them and the world in which they inhabit. While many writers imagine that their stat screen is a means to improve their world story, many end up writing stories where the world is simply a means to please the stat screen. Only the stat screen can't be pleased. It has no feelings, nor intention. The numbers aren't a cast of characters. The screen doesn't tell a story. At least, not a very good one. What the stats screen does is obscure the story, streamlining the messy details of the human experience into raw data that means nothing but takes up a lot of page space anyway. It creates a character who's positioned to reap all the rewards of their fantasy narrative while simultaneously being detached from it, who never puts anything at risk because everything's just an equation they can solve. It's also just really boring to look at. Not only are these characters spending most of their time interacting with what is basically just a touchscreen monitor, they're all interacting with the same fucking one! Even when the menus of these stories cross-pollinate, rip off from each other are unique, a wise writer keeps their presence to an absolute minimum, because they can't tell a story better than the characters the audience is supposed to be invested in. User interfaces in games are largely supposed to be, well, not invisible per se. Seamless might be a better term. The best ones, no matter how vibrant or aesthetic, don't obscure the action. This is why it's wild to me that this trend would even catch on in video game stories, let alone game-adjacent fantasy settings. Furthermore, the UI is there to present information that helps the player play, but in non-interactive media, there is no player, so there is no need for a UI. Do you think the Sonic movies would have been improved if, after every scene, Sonic received an S rating for completing it quickly? Do you think the most recent Tomb Raider film would have been better received if a QuickTime event prop occasionally flashed on screen during an action scene? Do you think we'd all love the Pokemon show more if Ash selected Pikachu's moves from a menu, like in the games, rather than shouting them out? No, because UI isn't supposed to be the focus. It's the means through which you experience the story, but it's not the story itself. This problem again rises simply from the insistence on giving the protagonist the role of both character and player, a choice that carries with it a whole host of problems for seemingly very little benefit. What benefit a game like Magic System and UI does bring to a story is pretty obvious. Video game developers have spent many decades refining the subtle art of the Skinner box, providing their players little incentives to keep their fingers glued to their buttons. The simplest methods provide players with a steady stream of small boosts to their avatar's abilities and statistics, forming a sort of peanut trail to keep them always feeling empowered and working for that next bonus and its accompanying shot of feel-good juice, in a system I like to call He Who Number Go Up. The great news for writers is that you can easily crowbar this system out of a game, cram it into a story, and it'll work just as effectively on readers as it will on players. Congratulations, you now have a surefire way to make the story feel like it's constantly progressing and that your character is growing, regardless of your actual narrative structure, because, and I repeat myself, He Who Number Go Up. Unsure of where your characters are going? No worries, there's no such thing as filler if it makes your character stronger. Want to meaningfully develop two characters' relationships? Simple, just make them get their numbers higher together. Has it been a while since any of your characters expressed a sincere human emotion? Worried your audience might be struggling to relate to them, and will soon see through the flimsy facade of flashy magic and discount store-brand elf fears you've constructed to distract them from the growing void of meaning both in your work and within yourself? I'm sure there's a skill you can introduce to solve that. And what's the point of it all anyway? If we're committed to gamifying our stories to this extent, what opportunities does it open up? We're still going through the same motions of building up an underdog hero to overcome a previously insurmountable threat, but at least before this, the reasons the hero was able to achieve the victory were meaningful. They would win by the strength of their virtue, or the unshakable nature of their faith, or even just, and I know some of you might roll your eyes at this, through the support of the community they built around them. There's a moral narrative in these stories that we can apply to our own lives, and these themes exist within the pseudo-games fantasies as well, but more out of habit than intent. Often these themes won't land in these stories because they're at odds with the mechanics of the world. A protagonist might be noble and virtuous, but in order for the rules of the universe to make sense, they also have to be mechanically stronger than their opposing force in order to succeed. Even when the text of the story states that it was the protagonist's virtues that allowed them to prevail, there will always be the thought lingering in the background that none of that would have mattered without the stats to back it up, which would just mean that it was the numbers that carried them over the finish line, not themselves. If a hero to achieve victory without power, that would break the rules of the world. It would feel cheap. It wouldn't be fair. But fairness is an odd commodity in a pseudo-game setting. If the rules of the game were fair, then everyone would remain at roughly the same power level. Everything would be balanced. Now, not only does conflict rarely arise from perfect balance, but equilibrium kind of invalidates the purpose of a level-based game design. The whole reason most authors want to use these game mechanics in their world building is to accentuate contrast, to put a level 1 peasant beside a level 40 knight and show the difference in their strength. But the only ways this gulf in power distribution would come about is either to extract an inherently unfair social hierarchy from our world and paste it onto a world with entirely different natural laws, or to tacitly admit the universe's system is inherently unfair right down to its very design. So either you end up with sloppy, unimaginative world building, or a story where the best your characters can do is to weaponize the universe's unfairness against their enemies, unable to ever build a more just and equitable world because it is simply impossible. This isn't all to say that this style of storytelling is entirely irredeemable, even if it cuts it pretty close. If I am to make an honest confession, there are a few stories from this subgenre that I have actually liked. The thing is, the main ways that these stories include game mechanics into their non-game settings is usually through throwaway gags and minor story beats that sit largely in the background. Because, funnily enough, the best way to write this subgenre is the same as anything else, which is to write a story, not a system. The stories I enjoy because of the characters within them and the trials and tribulations of their lives, which mostly don't even have a whiff of game mechanics to them. There might be a reason for that. In the end, I don't imagine that the problems I have with most writing for pseudo-game stories are all that much different to when a traditional fantasy or sci-fi writer gets lost in the world-building source. I will add the caveat, however, that the implications of the game systems are often much less thematically rich and often skew towards combative and hierarchical moral and political philosophies. So, watch out for that, I guess. Beyond that, there's really not that much more that really needs saying. A lot of these stories are striving more to be entertaining than artistically rich, more empty-calorie wish fulfillment than gourmet intellectual cuisine. I don't subscribe to the turn-your-brain-off mentality, but I respect the sanctity of self-indulgence when it comes to media. That is, so long as that media isn't indulging in video game-based crypto-fascism. And they put away those fucking screens!